Hello, and welcome to Made in Paterson, the life and legacy of William Hughes, 1872 to 2022. My name is Dan Willever, and I'm a social studies teacher at Ramsey High School in Bergen County, New Jersey, as well as a native of Passaic County. And I'm very excited to share with you about the life of a man who I feel is very underappreciated in local, state, and national history, Billy Hughes. I want to begin by speaking a little bit with you about my introduction to Billy Hughes, because this was a man who was totally unknown to me until about 3 or 4 years ago. In December of 2018, an article appeared in the Bergen Record about the restoration of 2 statues in front of the Passaic County Courthouse in downtown Paterson. And one of these statues was dedicated to a man named William Hughes. And you see it pictured there, as well as a photograph of the man on the left. So who was Billy Hughes? He was an Irishman, an immigrant, a real boy, a silk weaver, a law clerk, a stenographer, a soldier, a lawyer, a jurist, a friend of labor, a legislator, a husband, a father, and a Patersonian. But few people today know much about William Hughes and his contributions to history. He served in the United States Congress from 1903 to 1905, and again from 1907 to 1912. And he served as a U.S. Senator from 1913 until the very premature end of his life in January of 1918 at the age of only 45. He was a close friend of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson and a significant ally of the organized labor movement. And so I set out to learn as much as possible about this man. And for about the next hour, I'm going to share with you some of my research, mostly as it pertains to Hughes' life in Paterson and how his upbringing in Paterson and his early career in Paterson contributed to his achievements in public life. There have been some significant challenges in researching William Hughes. He's rarely mentioned in the secondary literature, the articles and the books written by historians about the progressive era. They write a lot about presidents like Woodrow Wilson or Theodore Roosevelt, and even some senators like Robert M. La Follette and other public officials, reformers, and so on. Hughes made significant contributions, but he tends to be overlooked or only mentioned as a peripheral figure. Then there's the other Hughes, Justice Charles Evans Hughes of the U.S. Supreme Court, former governor of New York, who challenged Woodrow Wilson for the presidency in 1916. So the life of William Hughes and the life of Charles Evans Hughes overlap, as does the life of Prime Minister Billy Hughes of Australia. And then there's the other congressman, William J. Hughes of southern New Jersey, who lived from 1932 to 2019. Finally, unlike many public officials who make arrangements for their public papers to be cataloged, stored, archived after they retire or pass away, that is not known to have happened in Billy's case. His papers are missing, not known to have survived. It's a mystery as to where they wound up. And so with those significant challenges, I had to rely on other archives and sources of information to try and uncover what I have ultimately been able to find about William Hughes. I've relied on the archives of the Woodrow Wilson papers at the University of Virginia, for example. Now, Wilson, of course, was governor of New Jersey before he was president of the United States, elected in 1912. And from the year 1910, the year he ran for governor, through the end of Hughes' life, their political fates were very much intertwined. Not only did they have a close personal friendship, but Hughes was very much seen as a mouthpiece of the Wilson administration in the Senate. Then there's William B. Wilson from Pennsylvania, congressman who served consecutively with William Hughes and who became Woodrow Wilson's first Secretary of Labor in 1913. These two men had a close working relationship, and his papers are at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Samuel Gompers was the president of the American Federation of Labor, the country's largest labor union, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this is a time period during which the American Federation of Labor is undergoing a shift in terms of how it advocated for labor's various causes. They sought, as of the last few years of the 1890s, to elect more union members to state legislatures and to the federal government. And Hughes is going to be one of these union card holders who ultimately becomes elected. In fact, he will be the first union card holder to be elected to the United States Senate, and as such becomes a leader of the labor group in Washington, D.C. Finally, there's the papers of Joseph Patrick Tumulty, also a New Jerseyan, also an Irishman. Joe Tumulty was the personal secretary of Woodrow Wilson when he was governor and later on president. He had a very close friendship with William Hughes, and the two corresponded throughout their time in public service, up until Hughes's death, of course, in 1918. And so more than any other archive, his papers have really shown significant light on the life of William Hughes, because a lot of Hughes's personal correspondence to Tumulty has been preserved at the Library of Congress. In addition to these various archival sources, I've also relied extensively on newspaper coverage, not just from the period of Hughes' life, but also after his death, to see how his legacy has been remembered and evolved over many decades. Of course, there's also the Congressional Record, which keeps track of all bills that are introduced in Congress, or the text of floor debates, of which William Hughes participated in many during his years on Capitol Hill. And then those few secondary sources that either shed light on Hughes directly and mention his contributions, or that talk about events and circumstances that had an impact on Hughes' life. To further contextualize the life of William Hughes, I've prepared this timeline to help us understand the period that we're talking about. Hughes is born in Ireland 7 years after the end of the U.S. Civil War in 1865. And his life extends through U.S. involvement in World War I. When he passes away January 30th, 1918, the United States is in preparation to send the first American troops over to Europe as part of the American Expeditionary Force. But there are several intervening events that are of great significance to state, local, and national history, as well as to Hughes' life. The founding of the American Federation of Labor, for example, in 1886, or the Spanish-American War of 1898, in which Hughes will volunteer to serve. Then there's the Paterson Great Fire of February 1902 and the flood of the following month. 1902 was a year in which Hughes was making a name for himself as a labor lawyer in Paterson, and also the year in which he pursued and won his first term in Congress. And of course, the Paterson Silk Strike of 1913, which corresponds with the first few months that Hughes is serving in the United States Senate. Lastly, the election of Woodrow Wilson as governor in 1910, which, as I've already mentioned, is the point at which the political lives of these two men are closely intertwined, as we will see. First, let us turn our attention to the birth and early life of William Hughes from 1872 to 1880. As I previously mentioned, Hughes was born April the 3rd, 1872, in the town of Drogheda, Ireland, County Louth. This is a city that sits about 25 miles north of Dublin on the River Boyne, close to the eastern coast of Ireland. It's a port town, and in the 1870s it had a population of about 15,000 people, but that population was falling as many Irish men and women emigrated overseas, usually in search of better economic opportunity. Now, the photo at right shows the River Boyne, specifically North Quay Street in Drogheda, between the years of 1860 and 1883. So roughly around the time period that Hughes was growing up there. In fact, this photo was taken just a few blocks from Billy Hughes' boyhood home in Drogheda, and so he very much would have experienced or witnessed scenes such as that which is shown here. This is the birth registration of Billy Hughes, filed April the 29th, 1872 with the local register. He was born to his father, Thomas Hughes, himself born 1836, and mother Ellen McKee Hughes, born 1843. And according to this birth registration, the family lived on Free School Lane in Drogheda, and his father worked as an iron molder. Billy is going to be the oldest of the Hughes children. We see here Free School Lane, which was little more than an alleyway and ran between William Street and Lawrence Street in the heart of Drogheda. At that time, there would have been about 8 to 12 small brick houses along the street, and the residents would have lived in the shadow of two larger structures. First, the Free School, which was founded in 1739, and the Singleton House, built by Henry Singleton, one of the most esteemed judges in 18th century Ireland, and also a close friend of the author Jonathan Swift. It was said to be one of the finest houses in all of Ireland. And we see here a photograph of Free School Lane as it exists today. It is no longer a through passage between those two streets, William and Lawrence Streets, but rather much of it has been developed into a shopping mall. The houses there were torn down and replaced with that structure in the 1970s. Ultimately, for whatever reason, and we can't be sure, but we can speculate that the reason the Hughes family leaves Ireland is in search of better economic opportunity. Now, Ellen Hughes and the children arrived in New York via Liverpool on May the 3rd, 1880, aboard the SS Spain of the National Line. They're presumed, of course, to have sailed from Ireland across the Irish Sea to Liverpool before making the journey across the Atlantic. And the manifest at the top of the screen lists Ellen, of course, and below that the oldest child, William, followed by brother Thomas, 2 years younger, and Nicholas, 2 years younger than him, and the youngest daughter, just 4 months old at this time, Mary. Now, it's likely that Thomas Sr. traveled to New York in advance of the family, probably by a few weeks or months. In fact, there's a Thomas Hughes that left Liverpool on March the 11th and arrived in New York March the 21st aboard the SS Republic. The journey would have taken about 10 days and cost approximately $25 per person. So we know that it would have cost a considerable sum for the Hughes family to make this journey. This is a quote from a National Line advertisement, circa 1880, the year that the Hughes family made this journey. The steerage is large, light, and airy, and warmed by steam in winter. Married couples and families are berthed together, single persons placed in separate rooms. Meals are served regularly 3 times a day by the ship's stewards, and consists of an unlimited quantity of good and wholesome provisions put on board under the inspection of the company's purveyor. Plenty of fresh drinking water, and the care of surgeon and stewards is free. And so, by June of 1880, the Hughes family is reunited in New York City. Growing up in Paterson, 1880 to 1897. According to the 1880 census, the Hughes family was living together on Washington Street in Manhattan. And by all accounts, they stayed there only a short while before resettling in Paterson by the end of that year, although it's not known exactly when. Now on this slide, we have a beautiful lithograph, first published in 1880 by Packard and Butler, a bird's eye view of Paterson. And I'd like to highlight a few aspects of this lithograph because there are several significant landmarks from Billy's life that are shown here. In the top row, second from right, we have the Barber Flax Spinning Mills. It is in these very mills that young Billy Hughes is going to take his very first job as a real boy. On the bottom row, second from right, we have the Rogers Locomotive Works. This is where Thomas Hughes Sr. will find work to support the family when they relocate to Paterson. And bottom, third from left, is the Hinchliffe Brothers Brewery. The Hinchliffe brothers became prominent in Democratic Party politics. One of them ultimately served as mayor of Paterson, but both were significant early supporters of William Hughes when he was beginning his political career in 1902. And as we look at the image of the city itself, we see in the foreground the railroad, and just behind that, the Morris Canal. And if we look just beyond that to the buildings of the city, Little Dublin, a community of Irish immigrants, is shown just past the canal and rail line in the foreground on the left side. And it is Little Dublin where the Hughes family, like many other Irish immigrants, will make their home. The family home was on Pine Street, just outside the neighborhood known as Little Dublin, which was traditionally viewed as the area west of Main Street and bordered by Mill Street, Van Houten Street, and Oliver Street. And in the 1970s, that street, Pine Street, was replaced by the entrance ramp for Route 19. So it no longer exists today. And for decades, the inhabitants of Little Dublin drew water from a spring at the intersection of Mill and Oliver Streets, which became known as the Dublin Spring. At the time of the Hughes family's arrival, Paterson was a city of about 51,000 people, with more than 5,000 Irish immigrants among the growing population. The job opportunities at the Irish-owned Barber Flax Mills were a huge attraction for immigrants seeking work in the late 19th century. And as I previously mentioned, young Billy Hughes worked there for about 2 months in 1882 as a real boy to help support the family as they got settled in their new home. This is a view from Garrett Mountain looking north over the city of Paterson, and just beyond the edge of the rocks there, the rock outcropping, we can make out a photograph of the Dublin neighborhood just beyond the Morris Canal there at the bottom of the screen. And this photograph was taken circa 1880, so roughly the time that the Hughes family was settling in Paterson. Of course, young Billy wasn't just working, he was also going to get an education in the city's public schools. For a short time, he attended Paterson Public School No. 2, built in 1871. It was designed by a local architect, E.J.M. Derrick. The Victorian Gothic school building still exists to this day. The building's about 2.5 stories tall and is now on the National Register of Historic Places. This photograph here shows a painting of a man named Thomas Barber, who lived from 1832 to 1885. He was the 5th son of William Barber, who founded the William Barber Linen Thread Company of Hildon, Ireland, and ultimately became the largest linen thread manufacturers in the world. Now, this man, Thomas, established the linen thread industry in the United States of America. Barber began thread manufacture in Paterson, New Jersey in 1864. The company ultimately owned 2 mills in the city, one at the intersection of Spruce and Barber Street, which was formerly owned by John Colt, and a newer one built on Grand Street between Prince and Spring Street, which was expanded in 1890. Now, the Spruce Street mill, the one we see pictured at right here, which was originally the Colt mill, burned down in 1879 and was rebuilt in 1881 in the style of the Grand Street mill. And it's in this new factory that young Billy Hughes in 1882 is going to be working as a real boy for a short period of time before leaving that behind and returning once again to pursue his education. There were close to 1,700 workers employed at the Barber Mills in Paterson during the 1870s. Thomas Hughes, in supporting the family, found work at the Rogers Locomotive Works, a sketch of which we see here from the early 20th century. And this is according to William Hughes' obituary, that when the father and his family first came to settle in Paterson, work was found at the Rogers Locomotive Works as an iron molder. Of course, it wasn't all work and school. Like most kids, Billy had hobbies. This article from the Montgomery Advertiser of Alabama from 30 July 1914 highlights a story that became widely known when Billy entered public service. Essentially, as many young boys are prone to do. Billy was fond of going swimming and wasn't bashful about swimming in the nude. When one day he was out swimming and a policeman came along and stole his clothes. And it says here, the proposition was a bit embarrassing, of course, but there was no way out of it. So Billy Hughes modestly pulled down the visor of his cap over his face, the cap being the one article the policeman had overlooked, and ran after the cop. This necessitated a Godiva trip right up into the business center of the town, for the officer in blue had the start of him. The plight of Billy Hughes standing like September morn on a street corner, persuading the policeman to give him back his clothes, is a thing that is talked about in Paterson even to the present day. And Billy, later on in life, is going to become quite adept at swimming. The article at Wright from 1893, which is actually the very first mention of Billy Hughes in any Paterson newspaper, highlights the Eastside working men's excursion to Greenwood Lake in northern Passaic County. And it says that William Hughes finished second in the swimming race. Just to highlight one other significant name shown in this article, that of Jehu Garlick. Jehu and William going to become very close friends. Jehu was Republican early on in life, but later switched to the Democratic Party and became Billy Hughes' first campaign manager when he ran for Congress. Greenwood Lake would have been a hot spot for Patersonians of all stripes in the late 19th and early 20th century. It was a huge vacation destination for both day trips and longer stays at the various hotels scattered around the edge of the lake. The lake is about 7.5 miles long and straddles the border between northern New Jersey and upstate New York in Orange County. Now, Billy, on a trip up to the lake, would have taken the Boonton branch of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Erie Railroad to Mountain View in what is now Wayne, and boarded a train on the New York and Greenwood Lake Railway to Sterling Forest, which we can see sits just along the state line between New Jersey and New York on the eastern shore of the lake. The train station is shown there. Billy's going to have a lifelong love of Greenwood Lake and the surrounding area, and will later on in life purchase a bungalow where he spends much of his summer days, along with family and friends, many of whom were from Paterson. There were several steamers that sailed on the lake at that time, the largest of which was the Montclair. Could hold 200 passengers. It was a double-decker steamboat with a paddle wheel on the side. The social atmosphere on the lake was quite lively, and a great number of prominent Patersonians, Newarkers, and New Yorkers owned homes or traveled there periodically to escape city life. Now, other than swimming, Billy Hughes and his younger brothers were also going to become quite adept bicycle riders and participated in bicycle races. Now, none was going to be as successful as younger brother Thomas, who becomes a championship bicycle racer from Paterson in the late 1890s and early 1900s. But this story highlights a harrowing experience shared by William and his youngest brother, Nicholas. It says, while the Union Cycle Club was returning from its weekly run last evening, some fool who must have been drunk or crazy drove a horse at breakneck speed along the road. The clatter of hooves warned some of the cyclers to get out of the way, several having narrow escapes. Down the bottom, William Hughes, the stenographer, and his brother Nick were riding a tandem and scorched after the flying wagon. They easily caught it, and while Nick steered the wheel, Billy caught the horse's bridle and stopped it. By this time, the body of cyclers had caught up to the wagon, and was only by the hardest work that Billy, who had quite a little legal knowledge, prevented the occupant of the wagon from injury. This is from the News of Paterson, August 4th, 1897. So this happens when Billy Hughes is about 25 years old. At that time, Billy Hughes would have been working in the city's textile mills. We're not sure which one, but that's what he would have been doing to make a living for himself. However, he had his sights set higher than a life in the factories. And so, according to many accounts, including his obituary, by 1893, Billy had enrolled himself at the Columbia Shorthand and Business College on Market Street in Paterson, taking stenography courses. Now, this school was founded by George Oakley in the early 1890s and catered to working class Patersonians who wanted to pursue a better life. A quote from one advertisement in 1895 reads, "Are you a silk worker? It matters not whether you are a weaver, a warper, a quiller, or a winder. If you are out of work and earning nothing, you are wasting your time. Enroll at Columbia Shorthand and Business College." And so it is this decision to attend these classes at Columbia and to learn a profession that set Billy Hughes on the path of pursuing the law and ultimately politics.
We turn our attention now to the year 1898, which was not just a momentous year in the history of the United States, but also the year in which young William Hughes had to navigate both love and war. February 15th, 1898, Havana Harbor, Cuba, the explosion of the USS Maine. Now, the central issue at this time was the Cuban War for Independence from the Spanish Empire. And the United States had actually sent the Maine down to Cuba to keep an eye on the Spanish, who were putting the Cubans into concentration camps, depriving them of their human rights. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans were dying. And of course, simultaneously, you had the yellow press that was drumming up support for a war. So this explosion of the USS Maine winds up being the casus belli, the cause for war that the United States can get behind and rally behind. The rallying cry was, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." However, the US as a whole feels that there's something to be gained here. And it's controversial to say the least, but the United States was looking to expand its overseas empire. And what better way to go about doing that than by challenging the power of a weakened Spanish empire in the Caribbean and in Asia. And so by April, the United States has declared war against Spain. And almost immediately, by the end of that month, hundreds of young men from Paterson are rushing off to enlist in the 2nd National Guard New Jersey Volunteer Infantry Regiment at the Paterson Armory. And it's going to take a couple weeks, but eventually they will make their way down to Seagirt, Camp Voorhees, named after Governor Voorhees of New Jersey at that time. They'll undergo training. They'll be fitted out with uniforms and equipment. And between May 13th to 15th, they'll officially be ushered into the U.S. Army with 51 officers and 979 enlisted men. By May the 30th, they received orders to depart for Chickamauga and depart by train, but upon arrival in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, they were diverted to Jacksonville, Florida, which is one of the staging grounds, along with Tampa, for this war, which primarily was fought in Cuba. The 2nd Regiment arrived in Jacksonville and are going to be encamped at Camp Springfield, also known as Camp Cuba Libre, or Free Cuba, where they're assigned to the 7th Army Corps under General Fitzhugh Lee. He is the former Democratic governor of Virginia, as well as a former Confederate general and the nephew of Robert Edward Lee. June 22nd would have been a happy day for the men of the 2nd New Jersey Volunteers. It was payday. They received the sum of $15.60 from Uncle Sam. However, they were frustrated to find out that they were not to be paid for the first 2 weeks that they had enlisted, May 1st to May 14th. This is a look at the Paterson Armory as it existed in the early 20th century. By that time, it was known as the 5th Regiment Armory in Paterson, which happened to be one of the first armories built under a law passed in 1889. It was built on ground which was originally 12 city lots and transferred to the state by Passaic County. The laying of the cornerstone of the Paterson National Guard Armory took place on Memorial Day in 1894, built for the state's 2nd Regiment. Completed in 1896, the 53,800 square foot crenellated 3-story brick and steel armory was situated on 1.2 acres in downtown Paterson and has been compared to a fortress or castle. Unfortunately, in recent decades, that structure fell into a state of disrepair and has essentially been torn down. This slide shows a map of Jacksonville as it existed in 1898, and as you trace the map northward from downtown Jacksonville, you will encounter the outline of Camp Cuba Libre along the banks of the St. Johns River. And the photograph, albeit a grainy one, at the right shows some of the activities in the camp, the tents that were set up, the wagons and horses. We can imagine that this would have been a pretty sweltering existence for the men of the 2nd New Jersey and the thousands of other men who were encamped there as part of the 7th Army Corps in the heat of the Florida summer. Now, Hughes is going to put his stenography skills to good work while serving in the 2nd New Jersey. While back in New Jersey at Seagirt, he's going to be hired as a stenographer for Governor Voorhees. And then when in Florida, he was transferred to the headquarters of General Lee. Now, as I previously mentioned, this General Lee, Fitzhugh Lee, is a well-connected, prominent individual, both in the Army and politically. And so there probably would have been some prominent visitors that Hughes may have encountered during his time working for General Lee. One example is this man seated at left, William Jennings Bryan. He was a presidential candidate of the Populist and Democratic parties in 1892, 1896, and 1900, and he's the future Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. Now, I can't be certain. This photograph comes from a history of the 2nd Regiment published in Paterson. I happen to believe that the man seated at center is none other than our friend William Hughes, a much younger William Hughes than the other photographs we have of him, but it bears a striking resemblance to the man. The photograph is not labeled other than to say this is a picture of the 3 amigos. Now, Hughes was probably frustrated by the fact that he had been sidelined into the headquarters of General Lee, away from many of the men who, again, many of whom were excited to go off and fight in the war. This is a recounting of his wartime service from July 13th, 1913, in the Washington Evening Star. This was published in the first few months that Hughes was a U.S. Senator. It says Hughes was at first bitterly disappointed when it seemed that his knowledge of bookkeeping and stenography was deemed more useful than his willingness to draw the sword. Now, he needn't have been frustrated, or I guess he should have been frustrated for other reasons, because nobody in the 2nd New Jersey or the 7th Army Corps, for that matter, was going to go off and fight in Cuba while the war was actively happening. They're largely going to be sidelined and remain in Jacksonville. The 2nd New Jersey will be sent home back to New Jersey in September, having never seen combat. Perhaps what made this deployment even more disappointing for Hughes was the segregation from his bride-in-waiting, Miss Margaret Hughes of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Now, as far as Hughes could tell, this was no relation to him, but they did share a last name. She was a summer visitor to Paterson in 1897, and the two became acquainted and then engaged, though William didn't want to marry her until he had finished his legal studies and could argue cases and thereby support a family. She was about 5 years younger than William and came from an Irish Catholic family, and she spent much of the summer of 1898 in Atlantic City to make it more convenient for Billy to visit her when on furlough, and corresponded with him throughout the war. And I have to give a shout out here to the Orrick family, who are direct descendants of William Hughes through his youngest daughter, Ruth, their mother. They were kind enough to provide me with a series of letters, this personal correspondence between William and Margaret back home in New Jersey. He wrote on June the 7th, 1898, from Camp Cuba Libre, "Well, our troubles commenced from the time we finished up our provisions and started in on what they call the traveling rations. This consists of canned corned beef, hardtack, and coffee. Canned corned beef is an instrument of the devil, calculated to drive men to perdition. I honestly would rather eat a linseed poultice that had seen service than this solidified refuse of a Chicago slaughterhouse. When we arrived at camp, about 50% of the men reported sick. I was going to have proper food if I had to go to General Lee. I told him if he could not handle it, he only had to say so, and I would go higher, and that when I did find out who was responsible, I was going to give him a talk down if I had to take a walk with a firing squad. Cuba has no horrors for me now. The worst we can get will be better than we have had here." Now, it wasn't all heat and bad food for the men down in Jacksonville in the summer of 1898. The 2nd Regiment was also asked to participate in the dedication of a Confederate War Memorial, and this speaks to the reunification efforts that were happening between the North and the South, the former Union and Confederacy at this time. And so in July, the troops paraded through downtown Jacksonville and participated in this dedication of a monument in Hemming Park in Jacksonville, Florida, which was actually removed in June of 2020. Now, General Fitzhugh Lee, who of course was the nephew of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, was in the reviewing stand, and as well as the grandson of Union General Ulysses S. Grant. They watched the unveiling of this statue from the piazza of the Windsor Hotel. And in addition, both Northern and Southern troops from Camp Cuba Libre attended the ceremony, and much of the oratory concerned the reuniting of North and South. Here's a photograph of about 30,000 troops parading through downtown Jacksonville in the summer of 1898. Billy is going to have the opportunity to make several trips home on furlough during the summer that he's serving in the 2nd New Jersey. And this newspaper article, recounting from much later after his death in 1925, talks a bit about the service he rendered to his fellow soldier and his fellow Patersonians on one of those trips. So it says he was given a message from one of the young men who came from a fine home here, meaning Paterson, and Billy called at the house and found that the folks were getting a large bundle ready to send to their loved one down in Jacksonville. Billy Hughes asked that he be allowed to carry the large affair to the young man, the package or bundle containing some delicacies and articles needed by the young man in camp. The family did not wish to burden Billy on the trip back to Florida, but he insisted, and one evening a rap came on the tent, and the young man went to see who it was. It was Billy Hughes with a smile and the bundle that he had brought all the way from Paterson. Billy also brought some words of good cheer from the family of the young man in the camp. So Billy here is serving as a go-between during his frequent trips back to New Jersey in the summer. And on one of those trips, he visits with Margaret in Atlantic City and convinces her to marry him. He had written to her on June 3rd, "Paterson is not such a bad place after all, pet, and you are fortunate to be there." So, of course, he was not just only thinking about Margaret, he was also thinking about his home in Paterson. Now, the 2nd New Jersey is going to return to Seagirt in late September, arriving in Paterson on October 18th, and they were mustered out of service in November. And the casualties, their service was not without risk. Casualties included 23 dead of disease, 1 man who had drowned, and 2 who had deserted. As previously mentioned, it was on his July furlough that Billy convinced Margaret to marry him, essentially by saying, "Look, I might be going off to war into battle any day. I might not live to return home. Please do me the honor of being my wife." When they first married, they lived with Margaret's mother, Maria, on Godwin Ave, and then later purchased a home of their own at 357 East 30th Street. Now, Margaret later on became an activist in her own right, establishing the Paterson chapter of the New Jersey Suffragist Society and campaigning for women's voting rights in Trenton, as well as Washington, D.C. They ultimately went on to have 2 daughters, which you see pictured here with their mother, circa 1913. Phyllis, the older daughter, was born in 1901, and Ruth was born in 1909. Rather tragically, Margaret's going to die quite young herself, just 7 years after her husband in March 1925, following a long illness. Her funeral mass was at St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church in Paterson. For the next few minutes, we'll discuss the pathway from a career in stenography that William Hughes took to entering the legal profession as a lawyer. Even prior to going off to war in 1898, he had already entered the Paterson law office of William M. Risdick. And of course, the war intervened and interrupted his studies. But after the war, he joined the law office of William Nelson, who was a pretty prominent Paterson lawyer, as well as historian of Paterson, Passaic County, and New Jersey. And then later joined that of U.S. Attorney General John W. Griggs. Now, Griggs was a Republican. He was a former governor of New Jersey who was born in Newton and is buried in Paterson to this day. After his studies, William is admitted to the bar in June of 1900, and he partnered with James G. Blauvelt, a former assemblyman and candidate for mayor of Paterson in 1911, to open a law practice at 150 Market Street. It's also during this time, when he's entering the legal profession, that Hughes is going to earn his reputation as a staunch friend of labor. Of course, he had spent much of his early life working in the textile mills of Paterson and was elected president of the East Side Working Men's Association in 1897. But it's during his work as a lawyer that he really becomes affiliated with the labor movement. As counsel for the Bricklayer and Masons Union, the Ribbon Weavers Union, the Bakers Union, and the United Silk Workers of America. Hughes was also made an honorary member of the Steam Shovel and Dredge Engineers and Cranemen's Union because of his stand in favor of pro-legislation. And it's this honorary membership, this possession of a union card, that will make him the first union card holder elected to the United States Senate. During the year 1901, that Hughes is going to embark on the case that's really going to make his name, his reputation in Paterson. The case is called Frank and Dugan v. Clemens Herald et al. So throughout 1901, Hughes was occupied with what was probably the biggest legal case of his career. In March, the primarily female silk ribbon weavers of the Frank and Dugan Company went on strike in support of the male workers who had been on strike since February 19th. The workers' primary cause was to be compensated for piecework, meaning they would be paid for each piece they made as opposed to by the hour or the day. The company, after failing to successfully negotiate, went to court to ask for an injunction. This was a common strategy that businesses used at the time, as courts in that era usually upheld contracts as sacrosanct and would fine or imprison workers for violating them. After some workers returned to the looms, those still striking demonstrated and harassed them as they were coming and going from work. Workers were called scabs. The New Jersey Chancery Court issued a strict injunction against the behavior, but it continued in violation of the court order. In June, 12 people, 9 women and 3 men, were put on trial for violating this court injunction. And that trial was overseen by the man shown at the right, at the time, Vice Chancellor Malin Pitney IV. 8 were found guilty, with 2 sentenced to prison time and 6 receiving fines. The case was appealed to the Chancery Court in Newark, but was upheld that fall. In total, 25 people were prosecuted in various trials for violating the injunction, with Hughes and Blauvelt representing most of them, tirelessly advocating to acquit them of charges and later to keep them out of prison. During one of the trials, Hughes was cross-examining a witness for Frank and Dugan, the company, who was filibustering his questions. After Hughes muttered, "Oh, will you shut up?" under his breath, he was fined for contempt of court. Now, as I previously said, this case was overheard by Vice Chancellor Malin Pitney. He was originally of Morristown. He was a conservative Republican, but had graduated from Princeton in the same class as Woodrow Wilson and was a friend of Woodrow Wilson. And he was later appointed as an Associate Justice to the U.S. Supreme Court from 1912 to 1922. He is also the great-grandfather of actor Christopher Reeve. The News of Paterson on July 3rd, 1901 highlighted the fact that Hughes was advocating tirelessly for these workers. They wrote, "Despite his hard, conscientious efforts, Mr. Hughes is doubtlessly the most squelched or silenced lawyer Paterson has today. He has been sat on, choked off, and fined for contempt. But he has stuck gamely to the fight and is making the effort of his life on behalf of his clients. Mr. Hughes' position is not at present an enviable one, but when this case is completed, it can at least be said of him, he was game." Our Billy, 1902 to 1917. This section of the presentation is going to highlight the period during which Hughes reached the apex of his political career and influence. Now, in order to understand Billy Hughes' rise to power in Congress and then ultimately as a U.S. Senator and confidant of President Wilson, we have to understand the context and the confluence of several forces, particularly the tension between business, big business, and organized labor during the Progressive era. And the man at left is Samuel Gompers. I mentioned him earlier as one of the archival sources that I used when researching Hughes. He was the president of the American Federation of Labor from its founding in 1886 until his death in 1924. The American Federation of Labor was a conglomeration of unions representing workers in dozens of industries. It became the largest labor union in the United States by the start of the 20th century. With 500,000 members in 1900, its membership had tripled by 1905. Now, the first decade of the 20th century was an era of open hostility between the interests of labor and industry. Employers launched the open shop movement to drive unions out of certain industries, and increasingly relied on the courts to enforce contracts through injunctions against strikes, which usually resulted in the jailing of workers. By the late 1890s, the American Federation of Labor, however, began pursuing a new strategy to achieve pro-labor reforms via elected politics. The American Federationists, the publication of the American Federation of Labor in 1898, published this segment, that the American Federation of Labor most firmly and unequivocally favors the independent use of the ballot by the trade unionists and working men, united regardless of party, that we may elect them from our own ranks to make new laws. However, one of the things that's going to happen during this period is that the Republican Party is going to be more inclined to support the interests of big business and protectionist trade policies, whereas the Democratic Party is going to become much more closely aligned with organized labor. The result of this was that the conflict between labor and industry spilled over into politics, even at the local level. So Billy Hughes runs for state assembly in 1901, but he loses that race. He's recruited by local Democrats, actually as their second pick, to challenge a man named William Barber, also of Paterson, and owner of the very factory in which William had worked as a real boy some 20 years before. And this Hughes-Barber congressional race is really going to go down in history among the generations of Patersonians who remembered it. Billy did not want to enter the race, that is, Billy Hughes did not want to enter the race, as he felt it was a lost cause. But Democrats needed a candidate, and he was convinced to run. Now, William Barber had essentially purchased the Republican nomination, edging out Paterson incumbent Congressman Republican James F. Stewart. The local newspapers wasted no time proclaiming Barber Congressman in waiting. For the nearly 45-year-old titan of industry carefully fostered his political relationships for many years prior to his run for office. He was a delegate at every Republican convention since James Blaine was nominated in 1884. Former President Ulysses S. Grant dined in the Barber family home when Grant visited on a tour of Paterson in 1880. The young Barber also hosted his personal friend, President William McKinley, in the Silk City on the occasion of Vice President and Patersonian Garrett A. Hobart's funeral in 1899. He was a known confidant of President Theodore Roosevelt. With such advantages, Barber no doubt harbored ambitions higher than the U.S. House of Representatives. This man was a well-connected, widely known figure possessing near unlimited financial resources and strong media support, running with unified party backing in a district where Republican voters significantly outnumbered Democrats. So popular and well-respected was the Colonel, who had earned his title as a member of New Jersey Governor John Griggs' staff, that he had managed to earn his party's nomination over incumbent Congressman Stewart. It was not without reason that the News of Paterson, in reporting upon Barber's candidacy, predicted he would easily win on Election Day by earning the largest vote majority of any local Republican candidate in recent history. And this 6th congressional district that Hughes and Barber are going to be squaring off in had produced a Republican majority for many years prior to 1902. But this projection, this relatively safe projection, never came to pass. On Election Day, Billy Hughes was declared the winner. So how did Hughes, a Democrat, win in this majority Republican district against such a well-financed and well-known opponent? Well, we can look at several factors. First, the role of the Passaic Daily News and local newspapers. The Passaic Daily News specifically was a newspaper founded by backers of Hughes to challenge some of the more pro-Republican press, such as the Morning Call or the News of Paterson. Republican voters actually backed Hughes in pretty significant numbers. Barber finished well behind other Republican candidates in the district. And that's mostly because Barber was unpopular with workers, the working class of Paterson. And of course, most of the city was working class. A lot of workers who would normally vote for a socialist candidate, as the Socialist Party actually garnered some significant political support in the early 20th century, actually supported Hughes in this election because of his pro-labor record. Now, when notified that he had defeated Barber, his former boss from when he was a child, he was asked to join in a parade around Barber's factory. Hughes rejected the offer, admitting he didn't have a good pair of shoes. Local newspapers predicted that Hughes would be a one-termer, and they were right, at least temporarily so. He narrowly lost by just a few hundred votes in 1904, the year in which Teddy Roosevelt was running for re-election, but was returned to Congress in 1906, 1908, and 1910. Earlier in this presentation, I mentioned the name Jehu Garlick. You may recall him as one of those East Side working men who traveled to Greenwood Lake for an outing there with Billy Hughes and participated in several athletic events there. I mentioned Jehu Garlick and Billy Hughes are going to become close friends, and that Garlick becomes Hughes' first campaign manager. He recounted several decades later that when Barber was campaigning against him, when the press was saying he couldn't win, he told Hughes, "Never you mind, Billy, you just kiss the babies and it'll all work out." And of course, it absolutely did. Another factor we can point to in explaining Hughes' victory is the work of a staunch group of volunteers, a zealous group of volunteers, of young Paterson men, both Democrats and Republicans. They called themselves the Hughes Volunteers and would play a role in each of Billy's campaigns for Congress and in his pursuit of the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate in 1912. They made their headquarters at the H. Munzer Building, 199 Market Street. The third floor served as the headquarters of the Hughes Volunteers. You see the building pictured there. It included such prominent men as Dr. Andrew McBride, mayor of Paterson, James J. O'Byrne, who became Hughes' personal secretary in Washington, D.C., and ran for Congress himself from Paterson in 1914. The Hinchliffe brothers, John and James, owners of the Hinchliffe Brewery, and a young policeman named Eddie McNamara, who you see pictured at right there. Now, Eddie McNamara later on became prominent in his own right. He lived from 1884 to 1944 and was for a time famous around Paterson as a police officer who had this booming baritone voice. Well, one day in 1914, he was overheard singing Il Pagliacci Prologue at the Paterson May Festival by German singer Madame Schumann-Heink, who lived nearby. This was a world-renowned singer. She convinced him to seek a professional career in voice. And along with friend William Hughes, then a U.S. Senator, they introduced him to Italian tenor Enrico Caruso. After hearing McNamara sing, Caruso called him the most natural organ he had ever heard and urged him to seek a professional teacher to help harness his raw vocal power and talent, to which McNamara responded, "Fine, what teacher?" Caruso replied, "Don't take a chance, I will teach you." Now, after getting training with Caruso, McNamara later went on a tour of the United States with Madame Schumann-Heink and went on to become a Broadway actor and later did several feature films with the likes of James Cagney and Spencer Tracy. Later went back to being a police officer between acting gigs in his hometown of Paterson. But William Hughes played a role in launching the career of this talented young man. In October 1903, this is the year after Hughes is elected to Congress, but just a month before he's actually due to take his seat in the first session of the 58th Congress. One of the worst floods in modern history struck the city of Paterson and surrounding areas. Eclipsing the epic flood of March 1902, the 1903 flood occurred after more than 9 inches of rain fell between October 6th and October 8th. The Passaic River quickly overflowed its banks and remained above flood levels until October 19th. According to a report on the flood issued by the U.S. Geologic Survey the following year, ordinarily the channel of the lower Passaic carries about 12,000 cubic feet of water per second, but at the height of this flood, it carried about 35,000 cubic feet per second. This was significantly higher than the 25,000 cubic feet per second that had been estimated in the flood of 1902. William Hughes on the cusp of leaving Paterson to begin his first term in Washington, was praised for his heroism during the flood. On October 12th, it was reported by the Morning Call that Hughes joined the volunteer forces who assembled to evacuate stranded families from River Street, using slings and pulleys to hoist them over rooftops to safety. Hughes later rowed a boat down Godwin Street to deliver supplies to those trapped there and to evacuate a man with a broken leg. Property losses in Paterson from the flood were estimated at $3 million. Several thousand men were out of work and hundreds of families lost their homes. Owing to the flood of water pouring down the side of Garrett Rock, it was necessary to cut the Morris Canal, which ran along the slope of Garrett Mountain along the southern edge of Paterson, in 4 places. Now, less than a month after the flood, Hughes safely arrived in Washington. And the reason that I mention this flood is because it clearly shaped his understanding of how he could serve his community. In fact, the very first bill that Hughes introduces in Congress on November 13th was Concurrent Resolution 5, to initiate a survey of the Passaic River in an effort to identify appropriate measures aimed at preventing future floods. A brief look at Hughes' electoral record over the first decade of the 20th century. I already mentioned that he's defeated in his state assembly race in 1901, but defeats Barber for Congress in 1902, then loses after his first term in 1904, really difficult year for Democrats around the country with a popular incumbent Republican president at the top of the ticket. But he wins in 1906, 1908, 1910, gets a lot of Republican crossover support in those campaigns. But by 1912, I think there's a frustration that Billy's experiencing. Republicans still control Congress. There's a Republican president. They're not able to get a lot done. Billy's not able to get a lot of his priorities done, particularly his labor priorities, with Republicans in control. But his friend, Governor Wilson, appoints him to the Passaic County judgeship in 1912, and so Hughes resigns from Congress in that year. Now, Wilson is undertaking his first campaign for the presidency around the same time, and Hughes will only serve as a judge for a short period. He doesn't care for it very much, and so Wilson asks Hughes to undertake a campaign for U.S. Senate against former Senator James Smith Jr. And it's from this point forward that the political relationship and the political lives of these two men are very closely intertwined. A little bit about the friendship between these two men and how it formed. The origins of their friendship and political alliance date to 1910, when Wilson, then president of Princeton University, was running for governor and Hughes was running for his 4th term in the House. Now, Wilson's record as a Democrat was questionable at best, and labor interests especially were very pessimistic about Wilson. They did not want him elected governor because he was seen as having a pretty staunchly anti-labor record in terms of some of the speeches that he and things that he had written. Now, Hughes himself was initially opposed to Wilson's nomination, but got on board just before the Democratic convention in September. This was perhaps a pragmatic decision, as Democrats had lost the last 5 gubernatorial elections and wanted to back a winner. Hughes campaigning with and for Wilson helped to ease labor's concerns about the candidate. Ironically, Wilson was running against a Paterson lawyer, Republican Vivian M. Lewis. Now, the friendship between Hughes and Wilson, whether based upon political pragmatism or genuine affection at first, developed shortly after the election and endured for the remainder of Hughes's life. We see here a message that Billy sent to Wilson requesting that the two meet and become more closely acquainted. Whenever they did finally meet, the two men struck up a friendship that lasted throughout Wilson's presidency and ultimately until the end of Hughes' life. In a letter to Woodrow Wilson on December 9, 1910, Hughes actually predicted that Wilson would be a favorite to win the presidency in 1912. And during the Democratic National Convention in Baltimore, the same convention that nominated Wilson for the presidency in 1912, Wilson was actually thinking about withdrawing from the race. He was behind in the delegate count. Well, one story that I came across says that Wilson sought to send a telegram to his opponent saying that he was going to drop out of the race. He was going to concede. But Billy Hughes claimed responsibility for stopping that telegram going through. And for Wilson, it's a good thing, and for Hughes, it's a good thing that he did do that, because it ultimately helped Wilson get elected to the presidency and Hughes get elected to the U.S. Senate. As we said, Hughes resigned from Congress in mid-1912 to take a judgeship from Wilson at Passaic County Court of Common Pleas, but he hated being a judge, and Wilson convinced him to run for Senate. His primary election victory over former senator and political boss James Smith was pretty remarkable. He was going up against a giant political boss in New Jersey. But one quote from a Union official, John A. Moffett, said that you couldn't beat Billy Hughes with a Gatling gun in this race. That's how unstoppable he was. Prior to the 17th Amendment, which was ratified in 1913, senators were elected by the respective state legislatures in each state. So Hughes, when campaigning for Senate, was really campaigning for a Democratic legislature that would support him in the post. And on Wilson's presidential coattails, that's exactly what happened. This was a personal triumph for Wilson. In his just 2 years as governor, he had achieved the replacement of 2 Republican senators with 2 Democrats that he had essentially hand-selected. Now, in serving in the Senate, Hughes became the first senator to hold a Union card, of course, and was therefore de facto leader of the labor group in Congress that was closely aligned with the American Federation of Labor. His first year in the Senate was marred by a real estate scandal, but he was later exonerated, and the Paterson silk strike. He reported personally to Wilson about the situation in Paterson. He also oversaw the reform of tariff laws that he believed were to blame for the strike. He frequently met with Wilson about both New Jersey state politics and national politics, and was sometimes referred to as Wilson's pet senator, or was at least seen as Wilson's mouthpiece in the U.S. Senate, who oftentimes had to justify and support actions taken by Wilson and his administration. There were also immense personal challenges during Hughes' term. His mother, Ellen, and younger brother, Thomas, died less than a month apart in February and March 1915. The Hughes family, that is, Hughes, Margaret, and their 2 daughters, relocated to Washington, D.C. to spend more time there, but kept a home in Paterson and their cottage on Greenwood Lake. It was not until 1917 that Hughes spent significant time back in Paterson after falling seriously ill in April 1917. That summer, he traveled to Greenwood Lake for convalescence on the advice of doctors. Dr. Andrew F. McBride, former mayor of Paterson, frequently drove up to the lake to check on Hughes' health. Although we aren't sure of the ailment from which he suffered, he did have many teeth removed. The descendants of Hughes believe that it may have been some type of oral cancer, but was referred to at the time as an infection of the teeth. In early September, Hughes was hoping to return to Washington, but after returning to Paterson first, he was soon thereafter admitted to hospital in Trenton. As late as October, he pledged to his friend Joseph Patrick Tumulty, working at the White House, "Everybody knows I will be a candidate if I am alive," meaning that he would run for re-election in November 1918, which of course would have been the first time that he would have stood for election before all the voters of New Jersey, which at the time was a Republican-leaning state and had actually just voted against Wilson in 1916. Now, 1918 was a really tough year for Democrats across the board. But if any New Jersey Democrat was proven to have crossover appeal, it was Hughes. We'll never know if he could have won that race, but I think he would have come really close, if not outright victorious. He died on January 30th, 1918, at Mercer Hospital in Trenton at the young age of just 45 years. President Wilson, upon Hughes's death, sent a telegram to Mrs. Hughes saying, "My heart goes out to you in warmest and deepest sympathy. In the death of your husband, I have lost a friend for whom I had the deepest affection and a very genuine admiration." And I'd just like to refer here to this quote real quickly from 6 years prior, October 30th, 1912. This is the tail end of Wilson's presidential campaign and Hughes' campaign for the Senate. We see how fondly here that Wilson speaks of Hughes, a man who doesn't lose his balance, a man who keeps his head, a man who knows human nature, a man who loves the people and knows how to serve them. That is the kind of man I know Hughes to be. The picture at left shows William Hughes in Washington, D.C. with his friend, Senator Ollie James of Kentucky. Sadly, Ollie James also passes away in August of 1918, just a few months after his friend from New Jersey. I'd like to take just a few minutes here at the end of my presentation to consider how William Hughes has been remembered by Patersonians in the more than a century since his passing. Of course, there's the prominent statue in front of the Passaic County Courthouse, which has stood there since 1927. Now, the statue itself was crafted by the famous Italian sculptor Gaetano Federici, but it needed a lot of financial support to become a reality, which dates from roughly 1923 or 1924, when prominent Patersonians started speaking out and saying, "We need something to honor our Billy." The fundraising drive for the Hughes Monument was led by Harry B. Haynes, the legendary publisher of the Paterson News. And the American Federation of Labor and the workers of Paterson and many from around the country joined forces to donate in support of this project. Many labor leaders, representatives of the American Federation of Labor, gathered in Paterson with the residents of the city on June the 25th, 1927, to dedicate it. And speaking of Hughes' legacy, president of the American Federation of Labor at that time, William Green, said, quote, "In characteristic fashion, he gave freely to the cause of the strikers who were fighting for the realization and enjoyment of economic and industrial freedom and for the humanization of the industry." Here's a photograph of some of those labor leaders who gathered to honor Hughes in June of 1927. Hughes also left quite a significant political legacy behind him in terms of many of the Patersonians who had supported him for office, these Hughes volunteers who, many in their own right, went off to seek and run for higher office. Men such as Lynch, Hinchliffe, Duffy, and Dill. Dill was a two-time candidate for the governor of New Jersey. Jolson ran for a state assemblyman. And the O'Byrne family. The nephew of James O'Byrne, who you may recall was one of Hughes's staunchest supporters and his personal secretary, later on became Mayor Edward J. O'Byrne from 1956 to 1959. And so these young Democrats who were supporters of Hughes in the early 20th century, for more than half a century afterwards, more than 5 decades afterwards, are actively shaping the politics and the future of Paterson. In 1929, former Congressman Clarence Dunn Van Duzer, a Democrat from Nevada and a former friend of William Hughes, traveled to Paterson, and in his speech to locals was talking about his friendship with William Hughes. He said, and I quote, that Hughes was always telling me about New Jersey, about Paterson, and about his friends. I always found him measuring everything by the New Jersey standard. This pride for his state, his love for his city, was both appealing and beautiful. I think that's just very well said, and a nice homage to Hughes and his respect and deep love for Paterson. Finally, let's go back to the year 1880, the very year in which the Hughes family arrived from Ireland in North America and settled in Paterson. It's in that very year, December 11th to be exact, that former President Ulysses S. Grant, a Republican, visited Paterson on a tour. And as you may recall from earlier in the presentation, it is William Barber who gives President Grant that tour around Paterson, and Grant goes and dines at the Barber home. But during this visit to the city, Grant gives the following remarks as part of a larger speech. He said, "It has afforded me great pleasure to visit the industries of your city, which go so far to make up the grandeur of the grandest nation which the sun shines on, and the only one where it is comparatively easy for a man to rise from poverty to affluence, and from any position to the highest in society." Now, maybe it's just the romantic in me, and of course there's no way to know for sure, but I love to imagine a young Billy Hughes, just 8 years old, maybe standing with his father, watching this great American statesman speak in Paterson, hearing these words about living the American dream, about the right to rise in the United States, and thinking that that was not just a promise, but that was something that Hughes would go about throughout his life, turning into a prophecy. Thank you very much for listening.